Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're diving deep into the world of Big Pharma.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a whole stack of sources, documentaries, interviews, real-life stories, you name it.
Wow, sounds fascinating.
And they all seem to point to one big question. Has the pursuit of profit in the pharmaceutical industry, has it become a threat to public health?
That's a really important question to consider. It's interesting because we often view the pharmaceutical industry as these amazing innovators.
Yeah.
They're bringing us life-saving medications, right? But at the same time, there's this growing concern about their focus on profits. And sometimes, you kind of feel like maybe it comes at the expense of patients.
Yeah, that tension definitely seems to be there. And I think one of the most infamous cases, one that really brought this issue to light, was that of Martin Shkreli, the so-called pharma bro. He bought the rights to Daraprim, this drug that treats a serious infection in people with AIDS.
Right.
And then he raised the price overnight, like by 5,000%.
Yeah, it's crazy. It went from something like $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill. Just like that.
Wow.
And what's even more shocking is, Shkreli defended his actions, saying his responsibility was to his shareholders, not the patients, who are struggling to afford the medication.
Yeah, and that kind of raises the question, right? Like, isn't maximizing shareholder value, isn't that like the fundamental goal of any publicly traded company?
Right. That's the way it works.
So where do we draw the line then
Yeah.
when it comes to, life-saving drugs?
That's the ethical dilemma here, right at the heart of this whole issue. The pharmaceutical industry operates within this, well, it's a for-profit system. But when profits come at the cost of people's lives, it really, it makes you question the whole system.
Exactly. And it gets worse. So Shkreli gets brought before Congress, right? They're asking him about this price hike, and they ask him specifically, what would he say to a pregnant woman living with AIDS who couldn't afford this drug that she needed?
Oh, gosh.
And he just refused to answer.
Yeah, he just wouldn't answer.
Pleaded the fifth.
Yeah, I remember that.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah, the public was outraged. Shkreli became kind of I guess you could say, like a poster child for corporate greed.
For sure.
And the Daraprim case, I think it really exposed that potential conflict that's always there between profits and patient well-being in the pharmaceutical industry. It just brought it out into the open.
Yeah, no, it was a real turning point. And here's the kicker. Even after all the backlash, right? Even after Shkreli was convicted on other charges, that price of Daraprim, it never went back down. So it makes you think it wasn't just about one greedy individual. Right. It speaks to a larger systemic issue.
Absolutely. It's systemic. Yeah. The Shkreli case, it did spark a conversation, a much needed conversation, I think, about drug pricing and the industry's responsibility to patients. But Big Pharma's influence, it goes beyond just the prices. They shape public perception, and they even influence medical practice in a lot of ways. A good example of that is the story of Gardasil, the HPV vaccine.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into that. Gardasil, that was seen as a potential blockbuster drug, right? And Merck, the manufacturer, they launched this huge marketing and lobbying campaign to promote it.
Yeah, huge. They lobbied politicians. They targeted public health officials. They even spent millions and millions on direct-to-consumer advertising. It was like a full court press, to get this vaccine adopted as widely as possible.
And one of the most striking examples of that was Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas. He actually mandated the Gardasil vaccine for all young girls in the state, framed it as this, like the silver bullet to eradicate cervical cancer.
Yeah, and that's where things get, even more complex.
Yeah.
So Diane Harper, she's a leading HPV expert.
Yeah.
And she was actually involved in the vaccine's development, but she became a critic of Merck's marketing tactics.
Yeah, and she accused them of using fear to sell the vaccine, like really overstating its effectiveness and downplaying any potential side effects. She felt like they were putting profits ahead of, just a balanced and accurate portrayal of what the vaccine could and couldn't do.
Right. And she also argued that this aggressive push for universal Gardasil vaccination, she felt like it could be distorting public health priorities. Like maybe resources were being pulled away from other important preventative measures.
Right. So that raises the question, right? How much influence does Big Pharma actually have over our healthcare policies? It's a big one.
Yeah, it's a very concern. When you have these financial interests at play, it can be hard to know what's truly in the best interest of public health. It's crucial for us, the public, to be aware of these dynamics.
Absolutely. And, the Gardasil story gets even more complex when you start to consider the reports of potential side effects. And I mean, some of these reports are pretty serious. We're not just talking about like a sore arm after a shot, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a sensitive area. And it's important to acknowledge, like proving a causal link between a vaccine and a specific side effect. That's very difficult. Scientifically, it's very complex.
No, I understand that. But for someone like Jennifer Sear, who developed premature menopause and HPV lesions after receiving Gardasil, I mean, that scientific nuance, I don't know, might not be very reassuring to her. Her story and stories like hers, they're hard to ignore.
You're right. And these stories need to be heard. They need to be investigated.
Yeah.
In France, Jennifer Sear's case, along with numerous other reports of young women experiencing serious health problems after getting the Gardasil vaccine, I mean, they raised serious concern.
For sure.
And then, adding to the concern was that a Merck study that was intended to track long-term effects of Gardasil, they actually lost track of a significant number of the participants in the study. So it's even harder to assess the full scope of any potential long-term effects. What's crucial here is that the scientific community continues to investigate these reports, right? Openly and rigorously. Transparency is key. I mean, the safety of any medical intervention, especially one as widespread as a vaccine, is absolutely paramount.
Right. It's a difficult balance to strike, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, we want to rely on scientific evidence.
Absolutely.
But we also need to acknowledge those individual experiences and concerns.
Absolutely. And that, sort of leads us to another example where the potential risks of a drug were downplayed, potentially for profit. The Vioxx scandal. It's a classic case of how prioritizing profit over safety can have devastating consequences.
So we've seen how Big Pharma can, use its power to control those drug prices and shape public perception, right? But let's dive even deeper into that Vioxx scandal. I mean, Merck marketed this drug as a revolutionary arthritis treatment, right? With fewer side effects.
Right. And initially, it was a huge success. It was bringing in billions of dollars in revenue for Merck. But, then the evidence started to emerge, linking Vioxx to an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes. And I mean, we're not just talking about a handful of cases here. Potentially tens of thousands of people were harmed by this.
Yeah, it's scary to think that a drug that's supposed to alleviate pain could actually be putting people's lives in danger. How did something like this even happen?
Well, one of the things that's really disturbing about this whole thing is, there were warnings from within Merck itself about the potential dangers of Vioxx.
Oh, wow.
So internal documents that were revealed later showed that some of their own scientists had actually raised concerns about the safety of the drug. But those concerns were ignored.
So they knew about the risks, but they just chose to ignore them. That's just outrageous.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it gets worse. So there's evidence that Merck actively tried to suppress research findings that highlighted the risks of Vioxx.
Whoa.
They even went so far as to try to discredit doctors who were speaking out about the drug's dangers. It was really a concerted effort to protect their profits no matter what, no matter the cost.
It's just mind-blowing the lengths they went to. I mean, the Vioxx scandal, that really shook public trust in the pharmaceutical industry. It exposed just how much power these companies have and, what they might be willing to do to protect their profits, even if it means putting people's health at risk.
Absolutely. Merck eventually withdrew Vioxx from the market, but only after an estimated, 38,000 to 60,000 people died from Vioxx-related heart attacks.
Gosh.
They faced billions of dollars in lawsuits, but, at the end of the day, no amount of money can truly compensate for that level of loss and suffering. It's just tragic.
It really is. And I think the Vioxx case, it really serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when profits are prioritized over safety. But I think it's important to remember that not every drug company acts this way.
Right.
I mean, there are countless examples of companies out there developing life-saving medications and conducting ethical research. Still, the Vioxx case it's a wake-up call.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's crucial to acknowledge both the positive contributions of the pharmaceutical industry and the potential for wrongdoing when profits are the driving force. We need a system that can incentivize innovation while also safeguarding public health. It's a balance.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Finding that balance. Okay, so far we've seen how Big Pharma can kind of control drug prices, right? They can shape public perception, and they can even suppress unfavorable research findings. But their influence, it goes even deeper than that. Let's talk about psychiatry and how they might even be influencing the way we define and diagnose mental illness.
Yeah, so this is where the work of Dr. James Davies comes in. He's been very vocal about the increasing medicalization of psychiatry. He argues that the field has become, too reliant on medication, and that we're kind of pathologizing normal human experiences, turning everyday struggles into, these mental disorders.
So you mean like feeling sad or anxious sometimes, like those are now disorders?
Yeah, exactly. So Davies points to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's basically like the Bible of psychiatry, listing all of the officially recognized mental disorders and the criteria, for diagnosing them. But Davy argues that the process of adding new disorders to the DSM is far from scientific, and it's often influenced by pharmaceutical interests.
So you're saying that drug companies might be pushing to create new diagnoses so they can sell more medications. Is that what you're saying?
That's the concern. One of the prime examples that Davies uses is the creation of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD. He argues that this diagnosis was added to the DSM with very, very weak scientific evidence, potentially to create a market for a specific drug.
And that drug would be?
Serafem.
Yeah.
Which was just Prozac, basically repackaged and marketed specifically for PMDD. So it's the same drug,
yeah,
but just a new name, new market.
Wow.
This raises the possibility that diagnoses are being created not because they're scientifically valid, but because they offer an opportunity for profit.
It's disturbing to think that our understanding of mental health could be influenced by marketing strategies. So how pervasive is this influence within psychiatry? I mean, how big of a problem is this?
Well, remember those statistics we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
About psychiatrists receiving, the highest payments from Big Pharma compared to any other medical specialty? Those financial ties, they run deep.
Right. Right. And it's not just individual psychiatrists. It's like the pharmaceutical industry, they also heavily fund those professional organizations, like the American Psychiatric Association, the very organization that publishes the DSM.
Right, exactly. And when researchers looked at the panels that are, responsible for deciding which disorders to include in the DSM, they found that a shocking percentage of the members had financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry, especially on the panels that were considering disorders for which medications were, the first-line treatment.
Wait, so you're saying that the people who are deciding what is and isn't a mental disorder are often financially connected to the companies that profit from selling the drugs to treat those disorders? I mean, that's just crazy.
Yeah. In some cases, like 100% of the panel members had ties to the companies that would benefit from the diagnoses they were considering.
Wow.
It makes you question the objectivity of the whole process, right?
Right.
It's a tangled web. And it's really hard to see where the science ends and the marketing begins. It's all mixed up.
Yeah, no, that's a lot to take in. It seems like Big Pharma's influence it's just everywhere. I mean, it's pervasive.
It is pervasive, that's for sure. But, it's not about, I don't think it's about demonizing an entire industry.
Yeah.
There are a lot of good people working within the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And they've developed life-saving medications that have helped millions of people. But we need to be aware of these potential conflicts of interest, right? And advocate for greater transparency and ethical guidelines.
For sure.
It's about accountability.
Yeah. So we've explored these examples, of Big Pharma's influence, price gouging, shaping public perception, potentially suppressing research that they don't like, and maybe even influencing the way we diagnose mental illness. But how does this all play out in our everyday lives? Like, how do they actually exert their influence in more subtle ways? Like, what does that look like?
Well, one of the key mechanisms that they use is through something called key opinion leaders. Think of them as, the influencers of the medical world. So these are, doctors, researchers, often very well known in their field, who are paid by drug companies to promote their products. They're the experts.
Yeah, I've seen those. Like, they're on TV news segments. They're quoted in articles. They're presented as these experts, but they might have those financial ties to the companies whose products they're talking about.
Exactly. They speak at conferences, they conduct research, they even write articles for medical journals. And because they're seen as, these experts, their opinions, they carry a lot of weight.
With other doctors and even with the public. So they can really influence prescribing habits, treatment guidelines, and even, public perception of certain conditions and how they should be treated. They're influential. So it's like celebrity endorsements, but instead of sneakers or soda, we're talking about medications that can have serious implications for people's health.
Exactly. And the problem is these financial relationships, they aren't always disclosed.
Oh, wow.
So that lack of transparency, it creates this huge conflict of interest. Patients and even other doctors might not realize that the information they're getting, it's coming from someone who's financially tied to a particular drug company. And that erodes trust, which is essential in that doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds like a system that's just like ripe for manipulation.
It can be, unfortunately. And this influence, it's not just limited to individual doctors. Like drug companies, they fund, this vast network of medical conferences, research grants, educational programs. They have a hand in shaping the information that doctors receive.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the decisions they make about patient care, they're involved in a lot of different areas.
So what does this all mean for us then as patients? Like how do we navigate this complex world of healthcare and make informed decisions? When those profit motives and the scientific evidence, they're so entangled.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's a real challenge for all of us.
It can feel overwhelming, right? I mean, we're bombarded with information from every direction, drug ads on TV, sponsored content online, even those little pamphlets you see sitting in the doctor's office. Like, how do you even know what to trust anymore?
And it's not just, the overt marketing that's out there. It's the more subtle ways that our perceptions are shaped. Think about how certain conditions, like how they're portrayed in the media or how often we're kind of presented with pharmaceutical solutions as if that's the only option. These narratives, they could be influenced, consciously or unconsciously by industry interest.
Yeah, it's like, that saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So if the only solutions we're ever seeing are pills, we might forget that there are other approaches out there, right? Like lifestyle changes, therapy, or alternative treatments.
Right. And that kind of connects back to what we were talking about earlier with Dr. Davies' concerns about over-medicalization. When the focus is solely on finding a pill for every single problem, we risk losing sight of the bigger picture. The social, the environmental, the psychological factors that all contribute to our well-being. We forget about those.
Yeah, it's like we might be treating the symptoms, but we're not addressing the underlying causes. Like it's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly. And this reliance on pharmaceuticals, it can have these unintended consequences. It can lead to unnecessary drug use, potential side effects, and this kind of growing dependence on medication to solve, all of life's challenges. There's a pill for every ill, right? But at what cost? Are we losing the ability to cope with life's, normal ups and downs without turning to medication?
Yeah, it's a valid question. So how do we reclaim our agency, our ability to make these informed decisions about our health and well-being? Like how do we even begin to push back against this massive industry that seems to have so much power? It's daunting.
Well, it's true. Big Pharma does hold a lot of power.
Yeah.
But we have power too, right? As individuals and as a society. I think the first step is awareness. The more we understand about how the industry operates, how it works, the better equipped we are to make informed choices.
Yeah, knowledge is power, right? But what about, those of us who aren't scientists or medical professionals? Like it can be so hard to make sense of all of this complex information. It's a lot.
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. Question the information that you're given. Consider the source. Look for potential biases, seek out diverse perspectives. You have to become this savvy consumer of health information. It's like anything else.
So it's kind of like being a detective, right? You're following the money, you're looking for clues, you're trying to piece together the whole puzzle.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge your doctor, ask about alternative treatments, research those potential side effects. Your health, it's your responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And you have a right to be an active participant in your own care.
You're in the driver's seat, so we need to be informed, right? We need to think critically, and we need to advocate for ourselves. But what about systemic changes? Is there anything that can be done to actually rein in Big Pharma's power and really put public health first? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of policy solutions that people are talking about right now. Some advocate for stricter regulations on drug pricing and marketing. Others want to see greater transparency in clinical trials and in those financial relationships between between doctors and the industry, just more openness.
Yeah, and there's also a movement pushing for more publicly funded research and development. So the thinking there is, if taxpayers are footing the bill for research, then the resulting drugs and treatments, those should be affordable and accessible to everyone.
Right, right. And then there's the whole issue of the patent system. Currently it allows pharmaceutical companies to hold monopolies on their products for years, and that prevents competition and keeps those prices high. So people are pushing for reforms to the patent system to address that.
So it sounds like there are a lot of ideas out there, but it's going to take a lot of effort from everyone, right? Policymakers, healthcare professionals, and the public to really create change. It's going to be a big lift.
It's a complex issue, no doubt about it. But the stakes are high. We need to find a way to ensure that everyone has access to, safe, effective, and affordable healthcare. It's a fundamental right.
Yeah, absolutely. So this deep dive, it's been eye-opening, to say the least. We've explored some pretty troubling aspects of the pharmaceutical industry, from price gouging and misleading marketing to the suppression of research and those potential conflicts of interest. It's a lot.
But it's important to remember, there are dedicated and ethical people within the industry, and a lot of those life-saving drugs, they've come from their research. So it's not all bad.
Right. It's not about demonizing an entire industry. It's about acknowledging that there are some systemic problems that exist and working towards solutions that really put people's health and well-being first.
And that's where we as individuals, I think, that's where we come in. We need to stay informed, ask questions, advocate for ourselves and our loved ones, and support policies that promote transparency and accountability and a more equitable healthcare system. It's up to all of us.
Right. So what can our listeners do, to kind of protect themselves and make informed choices in this complicated world? What are some actionable steps?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to become that critical consumer of health information that we were talking about. Don't just accept what you're told, even from your doctor. Do your own research, look for multiple perspectives, and really question the motivations behind the information that you're receiving. You have to be skeptical.
Yeah, be that health detective. Follow the money, look for those biases, and put those pieces together for yourself. Don't rely on others.
Right. And remember, there are resources out there to help you. There are independent organizations like the Cochrane Collaboration and Prescribers, and they offer evidence-based reviews of drugs and treatments that are free from industry influence. They're independent. You can also find really reliable information from government agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration. So there's good information out there.
Right. Those are great resources. And don't forget the power of community. Talk to your friends, your family, other trusted sources. Share information, compare experiences, and just support each other in making these decisions. It's a lot easier when you don't feel like you're alone.
Absolutely. I think, the more we empower ourselves with knowledge and connect with others, the less susceptible we're going to be to manipulation, and the better equipped we'll be to make those choices that truly serve our health. We have to take control.
Yeah, for sure. I think, this has been a really, thought-provoking conversation. Before we wrap things up, I want to kind of turn to our listeners out there. We've seen some pretty concerning examples of Big Pharma's influence, but there are also stories of hope and resilience out there too.
Well, absolutely. There are patients who have challenged unfair pricing practices, doctors who have blown the whistle on unethical research, communities that are demanding a more equitable healthcare system. These stories, they remind us that even in the face of these really powerful forces, individuals can make a difference. You can fight back. So
what can individuals do then to kind of create change, on a larger scale? What can they do?
I think it starts with educating yourself. Read books, watch documentaries, follow independent news sources, and just talk about these issues. Have conversations.
Right. Support those organizations that are working to hold Big Pharma accountable and fight for patient rights.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Talk to your family and friends. Share information on social media. Write to your elected officials. Demand change. You can make a difference.
Every voice matters. Together, we can create a more just and equitable healthcare system, one that puts people before profits. It's possible.
We want to leave you with one final thought. We've seen how the pharmaceutical industry has really shaped our understanding of health and illness. But what if we challenged those assumptions? What if we looked beyond the pill for solutions? What if we focused on prevention and wellness and creating a society that really supports true well-being? It's a big question.
That's a powerful question for all of us to consider. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more, to keep digging.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious and stay well.